All right, Shalom. I want to start off by giving our praise, honor, and glory due to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakah Kodash. I'd like to give double honors unto the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, where I learned this truth from. And I'd like to say peace and salutations unto the hopefully elect. And today is Monday, April 28th, 2025, Missile Monday. And I have this article from CNBC, and it says, Iran says extremely cautious on success of nuclear talks with U.S. So I'm just going to go into this article and bring out a few scriptures. Lord willing, this lesson is edifying and straight to the point. And it says, Iran and the United States have agreed to continue nuclear talks next week. Both sides said on Saturday, though Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqi voiced extreme caution about the success of the negotiations to resolve a decades-long standoff. U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled confidence in clinching a new pact with the Islamic Republic that will block Tehran's path to a nuclear bomb. Araqi and Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff held a third round of talks in the Muscat through Omani mediators for around 6 hours, a week after a second round in Rome that both sides described as constructive. The negotiations are extremely serious and technical. There are still differences, both on major issues and on details, Araqi said. Araqi told Iranian state TV. There is seriousness and determination on both sides. However, our optimism about success of the talks remains extremely cautious. A senior U.S. administration official described the talks as positive and productive, adding that both sides agreed to meet again in Europe soon. There's still much to do, but further progress was made on getting to a deal, the official said. Earlier, Omani Foreign Minister Badir al-Busadi had said talks would continue next week with another high-level meeting provisionally scheduled for May 3rd. Araqi said Oman would announce the venue ahead of the lead negotiators meeting. Expert-level indirect talks took place in Muscat to design a framework for a potential nuclear deal. The presence of experts was beneficial. We will soon return to our capitals for further reviews to see how disagreements can be reduced, Araqi said. An Iranian official briefed about the talks told Reuters earlier that the expert-level negotiations were difficult, complicated, and serious. The only aim of these talks, Araqi said, was to build confidence about the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Trump, in an interview with Time magazine published on Friday, said, I think we're going to make a deal with Iran, but he repeated a threat of military action against Iran if diplomacy fails. Shortly after Araqi and Witkoff began their latest indirect talks on Saturday, Iranian state media reported a massive explosion at the country's Shahid Raji port near the southern city of Bandar Abbas, killing at least 4 people and injuring hundreds. So, as you can clearly see, Donald Trump is trying to make a deal with Iran to, pretty much persuade them to not, develop nuclear weapons, which is too late because there were 9 nuclear armed nations. Well, Iran is the 10th, and just to, prove that, because again, just a simple Google search, and this is factual, so current nuclear armed nations, and this is in order. So you have Russia, America, China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, and as of recently, Iran, and this is just a brief overview from one of the sources it listed. It says Iran has accumulated enough uranium enriched to 60% to build nuclear weapons, but the warhead would be large, unwieldy, and inconsistent with the weapons. And that's something pretty much going into whatever specific missile or whatever kind of missile they're developing. Obviously it's nuclear, but again, these are the current nuclear armed nations, man. And they can try to, make peace talks and all of this, but we already know how this is going to end. All of these nations that are at odds with America are angry at America. Even America's allies are angry at America, or eventually, if not all of them are angry now, all of them will be angry, in the near future, and they're going to aid in the destruction of this place. So I'm just going to read the rest of this, then bring out the scriptures. So it says maximum pressure. It says, while both Tehran and Washington, both Tehran and Washington have said they are set on pursuing diplomacy, they remain far apart on a dispute that has rumbled on for more than 2 decades. Trump, who has restored a maximum pressure campaign on Tehran since February, dished a 2015 nuclear pact between Iran and 6 world powers in 2018 during his first term, and reimposed crippling sanctions on Iran. Since 2019, Iran has breached the pact's nuclear curbs, including dramatically accelerating its enrichment of uranium to up to 60% purity. And what I just read, man, again, they have increased, as it says right here, man, they increased their uranium, their enriched uranium to 60%, which is more than enough for them to be able to develop their own weapons. So it says close to roughly 90% level that is weapons grade. According to the UN nuclear watchdog, U.S. Secretary State Marco Rubio said this week Iran would have to entirely stop enriching uranium under a deal and import any enriched uranium it needed to fuel its sole functioning atomic energy plant. Bashir, if I pronounced that correctly, it says Tehran is willing to negotiate some curbs on its nuclear work in return for the lifting of sanctions, according to Iranian officials. But ending its enrichment program or surrendering its enriched uranium stockpile are among Iran's red lines that could not be compromised in the talks. Moreover, European states have suggested to U.S. negotiators that a comprehensive deal should include limits preventing Iran from acquiring or finalizing the capacity to put a nuclear warhead on a ballistic missile. Several European diplomats said Tehran insists its defense capabilities, like its missile program, are not negotiable. An Iranian official with knowledge of the talks said on Friday that Tehran sees its missile program as a bigger obstacle in the talks. And that's pretty much what Donald Trump wants. He wants to pretty much disarm Iran, because they know that if Iran gets with Russia, then, that's no good for, the U.S., which is good news to us, the hopeful elect. But to the rest of these people, these politicians, it's not as bad news, because as it says in Ezekiel 38, which I may grab that Russia is going to be a guard to these nations, these different Arab nations, and again, Iran is, if they have not already, they have missiles, man. And again, they want to be like the U.S. and these other nuclear armed nations. They want to have their own nuclear stockpile in the event that, they're attacked, and they want to be able to defend themselves, which is understandable, but we already know how it's going to end, man. So yet again, I'm going to just start with the book of Joel chapter 3 and verse 9. And it says, proclaim ye this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up, beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say I'm strong. And again, this is what you're currently seeing, man. These smaller nations, exhausting their resources into, their nuclear stockpile or into war in general. They're exhausting their resources into war, and you clearly see this particular scripture. It fits, what's happening now, which, it includes these other nations as well that are, nuclear armed, but still even Iran, man, they're the weak saying that they're strong, like, they don't need, the U.S. Pretty much they're not going to let the U.S. stop them from developing their own missiles, because they want to be able to, defend themselves, and which Russia, is going to protect them during the time of World War III. But as we know, all of these heathen nations, they're going to be taken down, which the other verses are going to go into, But I'm going to get the book of Isaiah, chapter 9, verse 5. And it says, for every battle of the warrior is with confused noise, and garments rolled in blood, but this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. So right, man, this coming world war, this third world war is not going to be a traditional war, Now, as I always make mention, you will have, ground troops that are going to be going to war with each other, over there in the Middle East, the region of Saudi Arabia to be exact. This war is primarily going to be fought with nuclear missiles, man, these nuclear capabilities, because as we know, traditional warfare, is hand-to-hand combat, guerrilla warfare, men having swords, spears, shields, these different weapons of war, fighting on the battlefield, But this third world war is going to be fought with this nuclear technology. So I'm going to get the book of Isaiah chapter 54 and verse 16. And it says, behold, I have created the smith that bloweth the coals in the fire, and that bringeth forth an instrument for his work. And they have created the waster to destroy. And right, man, the modern day smith being these scientists and physicists that are behind developing these nuclear missiles. Because what does a blacksmith do? They create weapons of war. And what are these scientists doing? They're creating weapons of war, and not just any weapons, man. Weapons of mass destruction. because these missiles that are on the earth today literally have the capability of destroying the entire earth. But as we know, or should know, as it says in the scriptures, that the earth abideth forever. The entire earth will not be destroyed, but various land masses, are going to get hit with missiles. As we know, the two confirmed, lands that are going to get hit are America and Israel. America is going to be completely destroyed, and the land of Israel, will be destroyed, but it's going to be built back up. The land has to be cleansed. But again, just me speaking as a man, I believe that Russia, is going to get hit. China may get hit, Now, will they be completely destroyed? We'll just have to wait and see. But that's just, me, a personal belief of mine. I believe that, these various other nuclear armed nations, they're going to get hit as well, but they'll be built back up. And it just goes to show you, man, that this is the time that we're in. We're in a time of war right now, and it doesn't get any realer than this, man. While the American people are, still lost in the sauce, their president is creating enemies, left and right. America already has enemies. The primary, adversaries to America are Russia and China. And as of right now, China, there's with these, tariffs that are going on, man, they're pretty much trolling America. And it's kind of hilarious, the fact that China knows that a good majority of the things, I would probably say about 90%, of the things that are imported, to America, nine times out of 10 are coming from, China, or Taiwan, Mexico. Most of the things that are imported from America are coming from a different nation, but that primary nation being China, man, But we'll just see how this trade war plays out, But all of this is going to, lead up to World War III, So I'm just going to get Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Excuse me, Slakia. Let me get straight to the point. Verse 8. It says, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. So, right, we're in a time of hate, man. We're definitely in a time of war, because right now World War III is a cold war, and then it's eventually going to get hot, because as it says, which I'll grab that, the least of the flock is going to draw them out. The least of the flock being Amalek. The small hats over there in the land, they're going to do something that is going to cause, Russia and America to step in on behalf of their allies. Russia stepping in on behalf of, Iran, and America stepping in on behalf of Israel, the least of the flock. And, they can try to do all the peace talks they want, but it's all going to be for nothing, because again, like it's only one, peace talks aren't going to stop prophecy, man. That's all I'm going to say. That's just pretty much in a roundabout way what I'm trying to say, man. They can try to sit down and convince Iran to not develop weapons, and, it's not going to work. They're going to have their nuclear stockpile. Then when the time comes, they're also going to use their weapons, man, So I'm going to get the book of Jeremiah, chapter 49, and verse 20. And it says, therefore hear the counsel of the Lord that he hath taken against Edom, and his purposes that he hath purposed against the inhabitants of Teman. Surely the least of the flock shall draw them out. Surely he shall make their habitations desolate with them. And right, man, You know, the Lord has Edom in his sights. Who is Edom? The so-called white man. You know, because that's who this destruction is primarily for. You know, the nation of Edom. You know, the wicked. You know, 2/3 of our people are going to get caught in this destruction. And, you know, whatever heathens, they're just, you know, as I always say, they're collateral damage, you know, because if they haven't returned, you know, to their, you know, their homelands, you know, they're just over here in America just to die, you know, to make their little money and die. That's all they're over here for, you know. And it's real. It doesn't get any realer than that, man. You know, and then since I mentioned that, I'll grab it. Also, getting straight to the point, the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38 and verse 'I'll just start at 1. Ezekiel 38 and 1, it says, "And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth in all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, having a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords." So again, this is talking about Russia. You know, the Lord is putting that old USSR spirit, you know, back on Russia, because you clearly see how President Vladimir Putin is moving, man. You know, that he's ready to take this place down, man. You know, and he knows, you know, that so-called Negroes are the Israelites. You know, he may know that the Latinos and Native Americans are as well, but specifically, you know, when he sat and had that icon of, you know, our Lord Yahweh Shai, who the world ignorantly calls Jesus the Christ, you know, when he did that on camera, you know, he still had one of those icons. He pretty much showed that, you know, the Messiah is a so-called black man, you know, so they know. So I just wanted to make mention of that as well. So this is verse 5, and it says, "Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya, with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them." So, right, you know, these different Arab nations and even Elam, you know, and certain of these Hamite, you know, nations that Russia is in league with, that Russia are allies with, you know, they're going to be a guard unto them, you know. This is, you know, one reason why, you know, America fears Russia and Iran getting together, because, again, you know, that's bad news for them, because that's also, you know, part of this place going down and being destroyed, man. You know, it's getting real. So I was going to grab a couple more and that'll be it. So I'm going to get the book of Malachi, chapter 4 and verse 1. It says, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. And the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch." And right, the day that cometh, you know, that shall burn as an oven is World War III, also known as the day of the Lord, man. Because as different prophets describe it, man, it's a day of darkness, a day of gloominess, man. You know, it's not going to be a good day, you know, at all. It's going to be an extremely bad time, you know, for the wicked, you know, that are upon the earth, and which, you know, I may just go ahead and grab it. Zephaniah, because he's one prophet that mentions it. So Salakia. Salakia. Bear with me. Yeah, there it is. So this is Zephaniah chapter 1, and I'll start at verse 14. And it says, "The great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hasteth greatly, even the voice of the day of the Lord. The mighty man shall cry there bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of the trumpet and alarm against the fenced cities and against the high towers." Again, talking about America. Again, the day of the Lord is not going to be a good day, for the wicked. Again, the elect are going to be delivered from the destruction that the Lord is about to bring upon this place, Babylon, man. But it's not going to be good for the wicked. And let me grab this real quick in Isaiah 13, verse 4. And it says, "The noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land." Right. These missiles are going to be shot from one end of the earth and land, on the other side, so missiles are going to come from, Russia, China, all over the world, from these different nuclear armed nations. They're going to be launched, from the end of earth and land right on over here in America. It's going to destroy this entire land, So this is the book of Revelation, chapter 7 and verse 1. And it says, "And after these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living power. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our power in their foreheads." So, right, these are 4 literal angels, holding back the 4 winds, which the 4 winds, is the destruction, that is going to take place upon the earth, man, World War III, because there is an appointed time when this war is going to take place, when this destruction is going to take place, when our Lord Yahweh Shai also is going to return, in the midst of this war, to take down these nations. So I'm just going to get a couple more and that'll be it. I'm going to get the book of Revelation, chapter 11 and verse 14. And it says, "The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly." And we're seeing that, more and more, with these things that are going on. So again, as I've said, they can try, to do peace talks, but we'll just see how far that goes or how long that lasts, because the way it's looking, Trump isn't going to take those sanctions off of Iran, and Iran isn't going to stop building, missiles, So I'm going to end it with this. This is the book of Revelation, chapter 9 and verse 15. And it says, "And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year for to slay the third part of men." And the latter verses goes into, describing the missiles, and what they're going to do, but there's a particular hour, day, month, and year when this destruction is going to take place, man. And it says to slay the third part of men, because you have three classes of men on the earth. You have the sons of God, which are the Israelites, all 12 tribes from Judah, all the way down to Issachar. You have the sons of men, which are the heathen nations, and you have the sons of the wicked, which is the nation of Edom, the so-called white man, and they're the third part of men. That's who this destruction is for, the wicked, and as I've mentioned earlier, that you will have 2/3 of the nation of Israel that don't die in the midst of Jacob's trouble, that are pretty much preserved to receive that fire, ultimately for receiving the mark of the beast, and whatever heathens are over here, that couldn't go back or that didn't return to their homelands, they're going to die, in that destruction as well, man. But again, this judgment that the Lord is going to bring on the earth is primarily for Edom, but wicked Israelites and, you heathens are going to get caught up in it as well, So, Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. I want to give all praise, honor, and glory due to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakakwadash. I'd like to give double honors unto the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, who I learned this truth from. And I'd like to say peace and salutations unto the hopefully elect. Till next time I say Shalom.